"I wash the dishes and you adopt us," said the poor girl with her brother in her arms to the millionaire CEO, and what he did shocked everyone. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Pearl, Seattle's most exclusive restaurant, where a meal could cost more than most people's weekly salary. David Mitchell sat alone at his usual corner table, his Armani suit as pristine as his reputation in the tech world. At 36, he had everything money could buy, except the one thing he'd never thought he wanted. He was reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet when a small, trembling voice broke through his concentration. "Excuse me, mister." David looked up, annoyed by the interruption. Standing beside his table was a little girl with tangled blonde hair and eyes the color of winter sky. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, wearing a faded pink dress that had seen better days. In her thin arms, she cradled a toddler, a boy with the same blonde hair and those same haunting blue eyes. "How did you get in here?" David's voice was sharp. This wasn't the kind of place where children wandered in from the street. The girl's chin trembled, but she stood straighter. "Through the kitchen. The nice lady there gave us some bread." She shifted the sleeping boy higher in her arms, her small frame struggling with his weight. "Are you important?" "I suppose I am." David glanced around the restaurant, wondering where security was. "Where are your parents, child?" Something flickered across the girl's face, pain so raw it made David's chest tighten unexpectedly. They're with the angels now." The simple words hit harder than any boardroom confrontation David had ever faced. He set down his tablet, really looking at the children for the first time. The girl's dress wasn't just faded, it was too small, and there were dark circles under her eyes. The boy's clothes were clean but patched, and both children had that hollow look David recognized from the charity galas he attended but never really saw. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Emma. This is my brother Luke. He's 3 and I'm 7. She took a shaky breath. "We've been staying at different places since the accident. But they keep moving us, and I don't want Luke to be scared anymore." David felt something crack inside his chest. "What do you want from me, Emma?" Emma looked directly into his eyes with the maturity that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Her next words would echo in his mind for weeks to come, changing everything he thought he knew about his carefully ordered life. "I wash dishes, and you adopt us." The restaurant seemed to freeze around them. David stared at this tiny girl who had just proposed the most bizarre business transaction he'd ever heard. She wasn't begging, she was negotiating, offering her labor, her service, in exchange for something she needed more than anything: a home. "You wash dishes," David repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm good at it," Emma said quickly. "And I can clean, and I take care of Luke really well. I promise we won't be trouble. I just need someone to keep us together." David's throat felt tight. In all his years of corporate deals, hostile takeovers, and million-dollar negotiations, no one had ever made him an offer that rendered him completely speechless. But what happened next would shock everyone who witnessed it, including David himself. David Mitchell stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the tiny girl who had just made the most unusual business proposal of his life. Every conversation in the restaurant had stopped. Wealthy patrons at nearby tables stared openly, their crystal glasses forgotten as they witnessed something unprecedented in this temple of exclusivity. "You're coming home with me," David said quietly, the words surprising him as much as they surprised everyone else. Emma's grip on her sleeping brother tightened, her knuckles white against Luke's worn cotton shirt. "Tonight," she whispered, hope and disbelief warring in her expression, like she'd been hurt too many times to trust what she was hearing. "Right now." David pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with the decisive precision that had made him millions. "Marcus, bring the car around immediately. I'm bringing guests." The word felt strange on his tongue. When had he last had guests in his home? When had he last invited anyone into his carefully controlled world? Emma's legs seemed to give out completely. She sank into the leather chair across from David, Luke still cradled protectively in her arms, and for the first time since she'd approached his table, she looked like exactly what she was. A scared little girl who had been carrying the weight of the world on shoulders too small for such a burden. "I don't understand," she whispered, tears beginning to track down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "You don't even know us. You don't know our story or where we came from or why we're alone." David crouched down until he was eye-level with her, ignoring the expensive fabric of his suit pants touching the restaurant's marble floor. His voice was gentler than it had been in any boardroom negotiation. "You made me an offer, Emma. A fair trade, your work for a home. I'm accepting it, but here's my counteroffer. You don't wash my dishes. You don't work at all. You just be a kid." The tears came harder now, silent sobs shaking Emma's thin frame. David felt something crack deep in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for decades. When had he last cried? When had he last felt anything this deeply, this purely? "But if I don't work," Emma hiccuped, "why would you want us?" The question hit him like a physical blow. This child had been taught that her worth was tied to what she could provide, what service she could offer. How many adults had failed her to create such a transactional view of love? "Because you're brave," David said simply. "Because you love your brother enough to ask a stranger for help. Because everyone deserves a family." 25 minutes later, they were settled in the back of David's Mercedes, the leather seats still warm from the heated interior. Emma pressed her face against the rain-streaked window, watching Seattle's glittering skyline blur past while Luke slept peacefully against her shoulder, finally relaxed for the first time since David had met them. "Mr. David." Emma's voice was small in the car's quiet luxury. "Just David." She was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that revealed the depth of her fear. "Are you going to change your mind tomorrow? When you wake up and remember you don't really know us?" David's hands clenched in his lap. How many promises had been broken to make this child so afraid of hope? How many times had adults failed her? "No, Emma, I give you my word, and I don't break my promises." But as the city lights reflected in the window, David had no idea what he was really promising, or how completely these two children were about to transform his carefully ordered existence. David's mansion sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured grounds overlooking Lake Washington, its modern glass and steel architecture a testament to 20 years of relentless ambition. As they pulled through the electronic gates, past gardens that cost more to maintain monthly than most families spent on rent, Emma pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass in quick, excited puffs. "It's like a castle from the fairy tales Mama used to read to us," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. David felt his chest tighten at the past tense. Used to read. These children had lost so much more than just their parents. They'd lost their entire world, their sense of security, their childhood innocence. Mrs. Chen, David's housekeeper for the past 8 years, met them at the front door. Her usually composed expression faltered when she saw the children, but she'd worked for David long enough to adapt quickly to his unexpected decisions, though he'd never made one quite this life-changing before. "Mrs. Chen, I'd like you to meet Emma and Luke," David said, suddenly feeling awkward in his own entryway. The marble foyer, with its soaring 20-foot ceiling and crystal chandelier, suddenly seemed ostentatiously large. "They'll be staying with us." "Staying how long, Mr. Mitchell?" Mrs. Chen asked carefully, her eyes taking in Emma's too small dress and Luke's patched clothing with the practiced assessment of someone who'd raised 5 children of her own. David looked down at Emma, who was staring up at the chandelier with the same expression she might have worn if she'd discovered actual magic. The little girl looked impossibly small in this vast space, like a bird that had found itself in a cathedral. "Permanently," he said, the word surprising him with its finality, its weight. Mrs. Chen's expression immediately softened, her professional reserve melting into something warmer. "The guest bedrooms upstairs will need fresh linens and some adjustments for children. I'll prepare them right away." "Actually," Emma spoke up, her voice echoing strangely in the high-ceilinged space, "Luke gets really scared at night when he can't see me. We usually sleep together, if that's okay. I know it might seem weird, but he has nightmares about—" She stopped herself, biting her lip. David's throat constricted. Nightmares about what? Their parents' death? The chaos that followed? The uncertain weeks in foster care? "Of course that's okay," he said gently. "Mrs. Chen, could you prepare the blue bedroom? It's large enough for both of them. And maybe—" He hesitated, realizing he had no idea how to care for children. "Some warm milk, hot chocolate, and food. When did you last eat?" Emma's cheeks flushed deep red with shame. "This morning. The bread the nice lady at the restaurant gave us. She said not to tell anyone, but she felt sorry for us." David closed his eyes, feeling sick. 1 meal in an entire day. These children had been surviving on scraps and charity while he'd been complaining about his overpriced dinner getting cold. 2 hours later, after Emma and Luke had taken warm baths in the guest bathroom and eaten their first real meal in weeks, Mrs. Chen's homemade chicken soup, fresh bread, and milk so cold it made Luke giggle, David found himself in unfamiliar territory. He was sitting on the edge of the guest bed, watching Luke sleep in pajamas Mrs. Chen had found from her own grandchildren's visits, while Emma struggled to keep her eyes open, despite her obvious exhaustion. "David!" Emma's voice was drowsy, but edged with the worry that seemed to be her constant companion. "What is it, sweetheart? What if the people come looking for us? The ones from the agency who were supposed to watch us?" David's jaw clenched. Agencies, legal complications, official processes he'd bypassed in his impulse to help these children. But looking at Emma's terrified face, he knew there was absolutely no going back. "Let me worry about all of that," he said softly. "Your only job is to worry about being 7 years old." As Emma finally drifted off to sleep, her small hand still resting protectively on Luke's back, David sat in the darkness of his guest room, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into, and why, for the first time in years, that uncertainty didn't terrify him. The first week was complete and utter chaos. David Mitchell, who could command a boardroom full of tech executives without breaking a sweat, who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers with ice-cold precision, found himself completely out of his depth when faced with breakfast preferences, bedtime routines, and the complex emotional needs of 2 traumatized children. Tuesday morning brought the first crisis. Luke, who had seemed calm the night before, took one look at David approaching with a bath towel and began screaming with the raw terror of a child who'd experienced too much change too quickly. The sound cut through David like a blade, pure fear from someone so small. Emma appeared instantly, still in her borrowed pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. "Luke, it's okay. It's okay, baby." She knelt beside the bathtub, speaking in soothing tones that no 7-year-old should have to master. "David's nice. He's not going to hurt you." "He's afraid of the big bathtub," Emma explained to David, her voice matter-of-fact as if this was perfectly normal. "He's used to sink baths." David felt something twist painfully in his chest. Sink baths. These children had been living in places where they bathed in kitchen sinks, where a normal bathtub was too much luxury to expect. "Can you show me how?" David asked quietly, and Emma nodded with the serious responsibility of someone far older than her years. But Emma's maturity was both remarkable and heartbreaking. She helped Luke with everything, tying his shoes with careful concentration, brushing his teeth while singing a little song their mother had taught her, cutting his food into precise small pieces. She was 7 years old, but she moved through the world like a tiny mother, anticipating Luke's needs before he even expressed them. "Emma," David said on Thursday morning, watching her help Luke navigate his cereal bowl, her own breakfast growing cold as she focused entirely on her brother's needs. "You know you don't have to take care of everything anymore, right? Taking care of both of you, that's my job now." Emma looked up at him with those eyes that seemed far too wise, far too careful. "I know you said that, but he's my brother. I've always taken care of him." "Since when?" David asked gently. Emma's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, and David watched her face change, becoming distant and sad, since Mama got too tired to get out of bed. Since she started sleeping all the time and forgetting to make dinner. David's coffee cup froze at his lips. "How long was your mother sick, Emma?" "About a year, I think, maybe more. Time got confusing." Emma's voice was steady, but David could see the pain underneath. "Daddy was working all the time, trying to pay for her medicine. So I learned to take care of Luke. I got pretty good at it." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. This 7-year-old child had been caring for a sick mother and a toddler brother for over a year. The weight of responsibility she'd carried made his business pressures seem trivial, made his complaints about stress seem laughably insignificant. That afternoon, while Luke napped peacefully in the security of their shared bedroom, David found Emma in the kitchen, standing precariously on a chair she'd dragged over to the sink, methodically washing the lunch dishes with the concentrated focus of someone performing a sacred duty. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing?" She looked over her shoulder at him, soap suds up to her elbows. "You said I could keep my part of our deal. I wash dishes. You give us a home. I always keep my promises." David gently turned off the water and lifted her down from the chair, setting her carefully on the marble floor. "Emma, look at me. You don't owe me anything. This isn't a business transaction. You're not here because you can work for me. You're here because you're family now." Emma stared at him, genuine confusion written across her face like he'd spoken a foreign language. "But then why did you take us? If we're not useful, why would you want us?" The question pierced something deep in David's soul. How damaged had this child's world been that she couldn't imagine being wanted simply for existing? David crouched down to her level, searching for words he'd never had to find before. "Because you were brave enough to ask for help when Luke needed it. Because you love your brother so much that you'd offer to work for a stranger just to keep him safe. Because everyone deserves someone who cares about them, and you two deserve that more than anyone." Emma's lip trembled, and David could see her fighting tears. "Nobody's ever taken care of me before. I don't know how to let someone do that." David pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in decades, he held someone simply because they needed to be held, without any agenda or expectation beyond offering comfort to a child who'd been forced to grow up far too quickly. The authoritative knock on David's front door came on Monday morning at exactly 9:47 a.m., just as Emma and Luke were finishing their breakfast of Mrs. Chen's homemade pancakes, the first relaxed meal they'd shared since arriving. Through the security monitor's crystal-clear display, David saw a middle-aged woman in a grey government-issue suit, holding an official clipboard and wearing the expression of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Stay right here with Mrs. Chen," David instructed the children, but Emma's face had already drained of colour, her fork clattering against her plate. "It's them, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of too many disappointments. "They found us. They're going to take us back." David felt his protective instincts surge with surprising ferocity. "Nobody is taking you anywhere." He opened the door to face Sarah Martinez from Child Protective Services, whose professional smile couldn't quite hide her obvious surprise at the mansion's opulent surroundings. Her eyes took in the marble entryway, the expensive art, the obvious wealth, clearly recalibrating her approach. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Martinez with King County CPS. I'm here about 2 missing children, Emma and Luke Harrison. We have reason to believe they may be on your property." David's mind raced through possibilities, legal ramifications, potential strategies. He could lie, claim he'd never seen them, but through the open sightline to the kitchen, Emma and Luke were clearly visible, Emma having moved protectively in front of her brother, like a tiny sentinel. "They're here," David said simply, stepping aside. "They're safe, they're fed, and they're staying. Ms." Martinez entered, her trained eyes immediately assessing the situation. She noted the children's clean clothes, their obvious improved health, the way they clung to each other, but didn't appear afraid of David. "Emma, sweetheart," she said in the carefully modulated tone of someone used to dealing with traumatized children, "we've been very worried about you and Luke. You can't just disappear from your foster placement like that. The Hendersons were concerned." Emma stepped forward, her chin raised with defiant courage. "It wasn't a good place. They yelled a lot, and they said they might not be able to keep both of us." David felt his blood pressure spike dangerously. "What do you mean, might not be able to keep both of them?" Miss Martinez sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Luke is young and adaptable. 3-year-olds are easier to place permanently. Emma has been through significant trauma, and 7-year-olds who've experienced loss often have behavioral challenges that make placement more difficult. The Hendersons were willing to take Luke permanently, but Emma's situation was more complex. "No!" Emma's voice cut through the room with startling force. "We stay together. We promised Mama before she died that we'd never let anyone separate us. I won't break that promise." David watched Emma transform before his eyes, from the scared little girl who'd cried in his car to a fierce protector who would fight anyone, including the system designed to help her, to keep her brother safe. "Ms. Martinez," David said, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire, "what would it take for me to legally adopt both children? What's the process? What are the requirements? And how quickly can we make it happen?" The social worker's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Mr. Mitchell, adoption isn't something you decide overnight. There are extensive home studies, psychological evaluations, background checks, financial assessments, a minimum waiting period of 6 months." "I have resources," David interrupted. "I have an entire legal team, unlimited financial means, and most importantly, I have space in my home and my life for these children. What I'm asking is, can it be done?" Ms. Martinez looked between David's determined face and the children, who were now holding hands, united in their silent plea to remain together. She saw something in this unusual tableau that made her reconsider her standard procedures. "It's theoretically possible," she admitted slowly, "but it would require expedited processing, court hearings, extensive documentation, and in the meantime, the children would need to return to their assigned placement while we—" "No!" This time David's voice carried the finality of someone who'd built an empire by refusing to accept unacceptable options. "They stay here. I'll hire the best family attorneys in the state. I'll jump through every legal hoop you require. I'll submit to any evaluation or assessment you deem necessary. But they don't get separated, and they don't leave this house unless it's by their choice." "Ms." Martinez stared at him for a long moment, clearly wrestling with protocol versus the obvious welfare of the children. Finally, she pulled out her phone with the resigned expression of someone about to make her day much more complicated. "I need to make several calls and speak with my supervisor. This is highly irregular, but—" She glanced at Emma and Luke, who were watching her with the desperate hope of children who'd been disappointed too many times. Perhaps we can work something out. That evening, after Ms. Martinez had left with promises of emergency hearings, expedited home studies, and legal processes that would normally take months compressed into weeks, David found Emma on the terrace overlooking Lake Washington. She sat curled in one of the oversized patio chairs, her legs tucked beneath her, staring out at the city lights reflecting on the dark water like fallen stars. Luke was inside with Mrs. Chen, building elaborate towers with wooden blocks she'd discovered in the attic, his 3-year-old attention completely absorbed in the simple joy of creation and destruction. "Penny for your thoughts?" David said, settling into the chair beside Emma, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to give her space to process the day's emotional upheaval. Emma glanced at him, then back at the water. "What if she decides we can't stay? What if she makes us go back to the Hendersons or somewhere worse?" "She won't." "How can you know that for sure?" David was quiet for a moment, watching a seaplane's lights trace across the distant horizon. "Because I won't let it happen. Because some things in this world are worth fighting for, and you and Luke are definitely worth fighting for." Emma studied his profile in the soft glow of the terrace lighting. "Why are you really doing this? And don't say it's because I'm brave or because everyone deserves family. There has to be more to it than that." The question he'd been dreading, delivered with the directness of someone too young to understand social niceties. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? "Can I tell you a secret, Emma? Something I've never told anyone else?" She nodded solemnly, recognizing the weight of what he was offering. "I grew up in foster care too, from age 8 to 18. 10 different homes, 11 different schools, more social workers than I can remember." Emma's eyes widened with genuine surprise. "You did? But you're so successful, so important." "Success doesn't erase where you come from," David said softly. "I know what it feels like to pack everything you own in a garbage bag. I know what it's like to wonder if anyone will ever want to keep you, or if you're just temporarily convenient until something better comes along." The admission hung in the air between them, years of carefully guarded privacy dissolved in the service of helping this child understand she wasn't alone. "Did anyone ever want to keep you?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David felt the familiar ache of old rejection, softened now by time, but never completely healed. "No. But maybe that's exactly why I can keep you and Luke. Maybe everything I went through, all the loneliness and uncertainty, was preparing me to be here when you needed someone who would understand." Emma was quiet for a long time, processing this revelation that reframed everything she thought she knew about this man who'd appeared in her life like an answered prayer. Finally, she slipped her small hand into his much larger one, her fingers warm and trusting. "David?" "Yeah, kiddo. I'm really glad you were at that restaurant that night." "I'm glad you said yes." David squeezed her hand gently, feeling something heal in his chest that had been broken for decades. "Me too, Emma, me too." Deep. But as he sat there looking out at the city lights, David couldn't shake the growing feeling that there was something Emma hadn't told him about their parents' death, something about their story that didn't quite add up. The way she sometimes stopped herself mid-sentence, the careful way she chose her words when talking about the accident. And he was absolutely right to worry, because the truth about what had happened to the Harrison family was far more complicated and dangerous than anyone suspected. A truth that would soon threaten everything David was fighting to build. 3 weeks into their new life together, David discovered that being a guardian meant more than providing food and shelter. It meant navigating the complex emotional landscape of 2 children who'd experienced more loss than most adults could handle. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening. David had been working late in his home office, finalizing the adoption paperwork his legal team had expedited, when he heard crying from upstairs. Not Luke's usual nighttime tears, but Emma's. Deep, heartbroken sobs that cut through the house's expensive soundproofing. He found her in the bathroom, sitting on the floor in her pajamas, holding a hairbrush with several long blonde strands tangled in its bristles. "Emma, what's wrong, sweetheart?" "I can't remember how Mama used to braid my hair," she wailed, her voice breaking with despair. "She always did it before bed, but I can't remember the pattern. What if I forget everything about her?" David's heart shattered. He knelt beside her on the cold tile floor, pulling her into his arms. "Oh, honey, you won't forget. Love doesn't work that way." "But I already forgot what her laugh sounded like," Emma sobbed against his chest. "And Luke doesn't remember her at all anymore. Yesterday, he called Mrs. Chen Mama by accident." David held her tighter, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Emma, listen to me. Your Mama lives in all the ways you take care of Luke, in your kindness, in your strength. Memory isn't just about sounds and pictures. It's about the love that shaped you. Will you help me learn to braid my hair again?" David looked at the brush in her small hands, thinking about all the things he'd never learned, all the parental skills he'd assumed he'd never need. "I don't know how to braid hair. We could learn together." But they do. And so, at 10 o'clock that night, David Mitchell, CEO of a tech empire worth billions, sat on his bathroom floor with YouTube tutorials playing on his phone, learning to braid a 7-year-old's hair while she taught him the lullaby her mother used to sing. "You're getting better," Emma said encouragingly, as David fumbled through his 5th attempt at a French braid. "Your mother would probably laugh at how terrible I am at this." Emma smiled. The first real smile he'd seen when she talked about her parents. She would, but she'd also say that trying is what matters. She always said love isn't about being perfect, it's about showing up. David's hands stilled in her hair. "She sounds like she was very wise." "She was. Even when she was sick, she tried so hard to take care of us." Emma's voice grew quiet. "That's why what happened was so unfair." "Emma," David said gently, "do you want to tell me more about the accident?" Emma's body tensed. "It wasn't. I mean, yes, there was an accident, but—" She stopped, biting her lip. David sensed he was approaching something crucial, something Emma had been carrying alone. "But what, sweetheart? Can we finish my hair first?" "The story is too sad for right now." David nodded, understanding that some truths needed the right moment. But as he worked the soft strands of her hair into a passable braid, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's careful words hid something darker than a simple accident. David's first official meeting with Judge Patricia Coleman took place in her chambers on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later. The family court judge was known for her tough but fair approach to child welfare cases, and David had been warned that she didn't easily approve unusual adoption requests. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Coleman said, reviewing the thick file spread across her mahogany desk, "your petition is highly irregular. You're a single man with no previous parenting experience, requesting to adopt 2 children you've known for less than 6 weeks. Your Honor, those children were living on the street when I met them." Emma was 7 years old, carrying her 3-year-old brother, offering to wash dishes in exchange for a home. If that's not a testament to their need for stability, I don't know what is. Judge Coleman studied him over her reading glasses. "Ms. Martinez speaks highly of your home environment and your commitment to the children. However, there are some concerning gaps in the children's case file." David's attention sharpened. "What kind of gaps?" "The circumstances of their parents' death, for one. The original report lists it as a car accident, but there are inconsistencies. Hospital records that don't match the timeline, witness statements that contradict each other." She flipped through several pages. Most troubling, there are medical records suggesting Mrs. Harrison was treated for injuries consistent with domestic violence in the months before her death. David felt ice form in his stomach. Domestic violence. The records are sealed, but what I can tell you is that this case may be more complicated than you initially understood. Are you prepared for the possibility that these children have experienced trauma beyond the loss of their parents? David thought about Emma's careful words, her tendency to stop herself mid-sentence when talking about their father, the way she sometimes flinched at sudden loud noises. Yes, Your Honor. Whatever they've been through, they deserve safety and love. I can provide both. Judge Coleman made a note in the file. I'm approving temporary custody while we complete the investigation into their background. But Mr. Mitchell, if we discover anything that suggests these children are in danger, from their past or otherwise, this arrangement will be re-evaluated immediately. That evening, David found Emma in the living room, curled up with a book, while Luke built towers nearby with his beloved blocks. The domestic scene felt precious and fragile, like something that could shatter at any moment. Emma, can I ask you something important? She looked up, immediately alert to the serious tone in his voice. Is it about the meeting with the judge? Partly. Emma was your father. Did he ever hurt your mother? Or you and Luke? Emma's book slipped from her hands, and David saw fear flicker across her face before she carefully composed herself. A reaction far too practiced for a 7-year-old. Why would you ask that? Oh, because I need to understand what you've been through. And because if there's something you're afraid to tell me, I want you to know it's safe now. You're safe. Emma was quiet for so long that David wondered if she would answer at all. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Daddy wasn't always mean. Before Mama got sick, he was fun. He taught me to ride my bike and made Luke laugh all the time. Tears started flowing down her cheeks. But when Mama started needing medicine and couldn't work anymore, Daddy got angry a lot. He said it was too expensive, that we were ruining everything. David's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. Did he hurt you? Not me or Luke, but Mama. Sometimes she had bruises. She said she fell down a lot because of her medicine, but I knew that wasn't true. I'm not stupid. David pulled her into his arms, his heart breaking for this little girl who'd witnessed things no child should ever see. You're not stupid at all. You're incredibly brave. And I'm so sorry you had to go through that. The night of the accident, Emma whispered against his chest, they were fighting really bad. Daddy was yelling about money, and Mama was crying, and then they got in the car to go somewhere. That's when. She couldn't finish. David held her tighter, finally understanding the weight she'd been carrying. The accident hadn't just taken her parents. It had ended a nightmare, but also left her with complicated grief for a father who'd been both protector and threat. Emma, you never have to be afraid like that again. I promise you. But even as he made the promise, David wondered what other secrets were buried in the Harrison family's past, and whether they were truly safe from whatever had destroyed Emma and Luke's world. David's phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jarring him from the first deep sleep he'd managed in weeks. The caller ID showed his head of security, Marcus, which immediately sent alarm bells through his system. Sir, we have a situation. There's a man at your front gate claiming to be the children's uncle. He's aggressive, and he appears to have been drinking. David was out of bed and reaching for his clothes before Marcus finished speaking. Don't let him anywhere near the house. I'll be right down. Through the security monitors, David could see a man in his 40s, unshaven and swaying slightly, pounding on the gate's intercom system. Even through the grainy footage, David could see the family resemblance. The same blonde hair as Emma and Luke, the same blue eyes, though these were bloodshot and wild. "Open this damn gate!" the man was shouting. "Those are my brother's kids. You can't just steal them." David grabbed his phone and called the police before heading downstairs. As he passed the children's room, he could hear Luke crying and Emma's soft voice trying to comfort him. The shouting had woken them. "Stay in your room," David called through the door. "Everything's okay." But Emma opened the door, her face pale with terror. "That's Uncle Ray, isn't it, Daddy's brother?" David's blood ran cold at the recognition in her voice. "You know him. He came to the house sometimes when Daddy was angry. They'd drink together and yell at Mama about money. She was scared of him." Emma's voice was shaking. "He said mean things about Luke, called him names because he cried too much." David knelt down to Emma's eye level. "He's not getting anywhere near you or Luke, I promise." The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by then, Ray Harrison had escalated from shouting to throwing rocks at the security cameras. David watched from his office window as 2 officers approached the man who was claiming custody rights to children he'd apparently terrorized. "I'm their blood," Ray was shouting at the officers. "That rich bastard has no right to them. Their parents left them to me." David's legal mind immediately focused on the phrase, "left them to me." Had there been a will, legal guardianship documents he wasn't aware of? The adoption proceedings had been expedited, but what if there were legitimate family claims? An hour later, after Ray Harrison had been arrested for public intoxication and disturbing the peace, Detective Maria Santos knocked on David's door. She was part of the team investigating the original accident, and her expression was grim. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to talk. Mr. Harrison's claims about guardianship may have merit. We've discovered that Emma and Luke's father left a will naming his brother as the children's guardian in case of his death." David felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "That's impossible. The children were in foster care when I found them." "That's because Ray Harrison was in jail on a DUI charge when the accident happened. By the time he was released, the children had already entered the system. But now that he's asserting his rights..." "Detective, those children are terrified of him. Emma told me he was abusive, that he made threats. I understand your concern, but legally, blood relatives have priority in custody cases, especially when there's a will." Detective Santos looked genuinely sympathetic. "However, there may be other factors at play here. We've been investigating the circumstances of the accident more thoroughly, and there are some disturbing findings." David's pulse quickened. "What kind of findings?" "Evidence suggests the accident may not have been accidental. We found brake line damage that appears to have been deliberate. We're now treating this as a potential homicide investigation." The words hit David like a physical blow. Murder. Someone had deliberately killed Emma and Luke's parents, and now their uncle, possibly the same person who'd terrorized their mother, was claiming custody rights. "Detective, if Ray Harrison is a suspect in his brother's murder, surely that affects his custody claim." "It would if we had proof. Right now we have suspicions and circumstantial evidence. Not enough to deny his parental rights claim, but enough to keep investigating." She paused. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask, has Emma ever said anything about the night of the accident? Any details that might help our investigation?" David thought about Emma's careful words, her reluctance to discuss that night, the way she'd said her parents were fighting about money before they left. She mentioned they were arguing before they got in the car, something about finances. "That fits our theory. We believe Robert Harrison may have discovered something about his brother's business dealings, something worth killing for." Detective Santos handed him her card. "Mr. Mitchell, I can't officially advise you to keep those children away from their uncle, but unofficially, I'd suggest you have very good security." As David watched the detective's car disappear down his driveway, he realized that saving Emma and Luke might be far more complicated and dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Somewhere out there was a man who'd killed their parents and would probably kill again to get what he wanted. And what he wanted was sitting upstairs in David's guest room, two innocent children who might hold the key to exposing a murder. The revelation came 3 days later, not from Detective Santos or the legal team, but from Emma herself, during what should have been an ordinary bedtime routine. David was reading Luke a story about brave little rabbits, when Emma suddenly spoke from her bed across the room, her voice cutting through the gentle narrative like a blade. "Uncle Ray killed our parents." The book slipped from David's hands. Luke, already drowsy, barely stirred, but David felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. "Emma, what did you say?" Emma sat up in bed, her small frame silhouetted against the nightlight's gentle glow. Her voice was steady, but David could see her hands shaking as she finally released the secret she'd been carrying for months. "The night they died, I wasn't asleep when they started fighting. I heard everything." She took a shaky breath. "Daddy found out Uncle Ray was stealing money from Mama's medicine fund. He was taking the money we needed for her treatments and using it for drugs and gambling." David moved closer, his heart pounding. "Emma, are you sure about what you heard?" Daddy was shouting that Uncle Ray killed Mama just as much as if he'd poisoned her himself because she couldn't get the treatment she needed. He said he was going to the police the next morning, going to turn Uncle Ray in for theft and fraud. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Ray Harrison hadn't just been stealing from his sick sister-in-law, he'd been essentially murdering her by depriving her of life-saving medical care. "What happened next, sweetheart?" Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "Uncle Ray came to the house that night. I heard him through the bedroom wall. He was drunk and angry, and he said if Daddy went to the police, he'd make sure Daddy regretted it. They were yelling really loud, and Mama started crying and said they should leave, go somewhere safe until morning." David's blood turned to ice. "They left because they were afraid of your uncle?" "Mama said we could all go to her sister's house in Oregon, start over where Uncle Ray couldn't find us. She was packing our clothes when I fell asleep." Tears started streaming down Emma's face, "But I woke up when the police came. The accident had happened just a few miles from our house. Their car went off the road into Miller's Creek." David pulled Emma into his arms, his mind racing. "Emma, did you tell anyone what you heard that night?" "I tried to tell the first social worker, but she said children sometimes make up stories when they're traumatized. She said car accidents happen, and I shouldn't blame Uncle Ray just because I was scared of him." Emma's voice broke. "But I know what I heard, and I know Uncle Ray did something to their car." David's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. "Emma, I believe you, and we're going to make sure everyone else believes you too." As he dialed Detective Santos's number, Emma grabbed his arm. "David, there's something else. The reason Uncle Ray wants us so badly, it's not because he loves us." "What do you mean?" "Before Mama got really sick, our grandmother left us money in her will. A lot of money in something called a trust fund. Uncle Ray can only get it if he's our legal guardian." Emma's eyes were wide with understanding, beyond her years. "He killed our parents for money, and now he wants to use us to get more money." David felt a rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Ray Harrison hadn't just murdered his brother and sister-in-law. He'd done it for profit, and now he wanted to exploit the very children he'd orphaned. "Emma," David said, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through him, "you've been incredibly brave to tell me this. And I promise you, your uncle will never get his hands on you or Luke or that money." But as he waited for Detective Santos to answer her phone, David realized they were in a race against time. Ray Harrison's legal claim was being processed, and without concrete proof of his crimes, the system might hand two innocent children over to the man who'd murdered their parents. The truth was finally out, but the fight was just beginning. Detective Santos arrived at David's house within 30 minutes, bringing with her a child psychologist and a voice recorder. Emma's testimony, given in the safety of David's living room with Luke sleeping peacefully upstairs, provided the missing pieces that investigators had been seeking for months. "Emma, you're telling us that you heard your father threaten to go to the police about your uncle stealing money?" Detective Santos asked gently. Emma nodded, her small hand gripping David's tightly. "Daddy said Uncle Ray stole over $20,000 from Mama's medical fund. He had papers that proved it, bank statements and stuff. He said Uncle Ray was going to jail. And you heard your uncle threaten your father that same night? He said if Daddy talked to the police, he'd take care of the problem permanently. Those were his exact words. I remember because they scared me so much." The child psychologist, Dr. Williams, made careful notes. "Emma, has anyone coached you to say these things?" Emma looked confused. "What do you mean? Has anyone told you what to say or suggested that your uncle did something bad?" "No. I've wanted to tell someone the truth for so long, but nobody would listen. David's the first grown-up who believed me." Detective Santos exchanged glances with Dr. Williams. "Emma, we're going to need you to repeat this statement in front of a judge. It might be scary, but it would help make sure your uncle can't hurt anyone else. Would you be brave enough to do that?" Emma looked at David, who squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Will David be there with me?" "If that's what you need to feel safe, yes." Emma squared her small shoulders with determination that broke David's heart. "Then I'll do it, for Mama and Daddy, and so Uncle Ray can't hurt other people." The next 48 hours moved with the swift efficiency of justice finally awakened. Armed with Emma's testimony and new leads, investigators found the smoking gun they'd been seeking. Security footage from a gas station showing Ray Harrison tampering with a car matching his brother's on the night of the accident. Ray Harrison was arrested on charges of first-degree murder, fraud, and child endangerment. His claim for custody was immediately terminated, and David's adoption petition was fast-tracked through the system. Judge Coleman called David into her chambers 1 week later, this time with a very different demeanor. "Mr. Mitchell, I've reviewed all the evidence in this case, including Emma's testimony and the criminal charges against Raymond Harrison. I'm prepared to approve your adoption petition immediately." David felt tears he hadn't shed in decades threatening to spill over. "Your Honor, thank you. Those children have been through more than anyone should endure." "There's one more thing," Judge Coleman said, pulling out another file. "The Children's Trust Fund, which was indeed Ray Harrison's motive for seeking custody, will be held until they reach adulthood. But there's enough in the fund to ensure they receive the best education and opportunities. Combined with your resources and commitment, these children have a chance at a truly bright future." That evening, David gathered Emma and Luke in the living room for the conversation he'd been dreaming of having. "I have some very important news," he said, kneeling down to their level. "As of today, officially and legally, you're not just staying with me temporarily anymore. You're my children. Forever." Emma's eyes widened with wonder. "Really? Like adoption papers and everything?" "Adoption papers and everything. Emma Harrison Mitchell and Luke Harrison Mitchell, if you'd like to keep your parents' name along with mine." Luke, who had been quietly playing with his blocks, looked up with a smile that lit up the room. "Daddy David." David's heart swelled to bursting as he pulled both children into his arms. "Yes, buddy, Daddy David." Emma hugged him fiercely, her voice muffled against his chest. "I knew that night at the restaurant that you were different. I could tell you were someone who keeps promises." "Daddy, you..." As they sat together in the warmth of their living room, David realized that the scared, lonely man who'd been dining alone that rainy night had been transformed completely. Emma and Luke hadn't just gained a father. They'd given him the family he'd never known he was searching for. But there was still one final chapter to their story, one more crucial conversation that would determine not just their legal future, but the shape of the love that would define their family for years to come. 6 months later, David found himself back at the Pearl restaurant, but this time he wasn't alone. Emma sat across from him in a beautiful blue dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her pick out, while Luke wore his first real suit, a miniature version of David's own. The same corner table where their story had begun now hosted a very different kind of meeting. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" David asked Emma, who had requested this specific location for what she called our special dinner. Emma nodded solemnly, her blonde hair now healthy and shining, styled in the French braid she and David had finally mastered together. "This is where our family started, where you said yes when I asked you to adopt us." Luke, now 4 years old and bubbling with confidence, was carefully arranging his silverware in precise patterns, a habit he'd developed that reminded David daily of how far they'd all come. The terrified toddler who'd once clung to his sister was now a curious, joyful little boy who called David Daddy without hesitation and filled their house with laughter. "Mr. Mitchell," the restaurant manager approached their table with genuine warmth. "It's wonderful to see you again and to finally meet your beautiful children properly." David's chest swelled with pride he'd never known he could feel. "Thank you, James. This is Emma and Luke, my son and daughter." The words still gave him chills. Not his wards, not children he was fostering, but his son and daughter. The adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, but David didn't think he'd ever get tired of saying it. "Daddy," Emma said softly, "I have something I want to give you." She reached into her small purse, another sign of how much she'd grown, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. David recognized it immediately as the drawing paper he'd bought her when they'd discovered her artistic talent, one of many gifts that had emerged as she'd felt safe enough to explore her interests. David unfolded the paper carefully, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a drawing of that first night, a little girl holding a baby, standing next to a tall man in a restaurant. But in Emma's artistic vision, they weren't strangers. Golden light surrounded all 3 figures, and written at the bottom in her careful 7-year-old handwriting were the words, "The night we found our forever family." "Dear Emma," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I wanted you to have it so you'd always remember that even when something seems impossible, sometimes miracles happen." Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were happy tears. "You saved us, but I think maybe we saved you too." David reached across the table and took her small hand in his. "You absolutely did, sweetheart. I didn't even realize how empty my life was until you and Luke filled it with love." Luke, who had been listening with the intense focus he brought to important conversations, suddenly stood up on his chair and reached for David. "Daddy, hug." David lifted Luke into his arms, and Emma came around the table to complete their circle. As they held each other in the elegant restaurant where it had all begun, David marveled at the transformation they'd all undergone. Emma was thriving in school, her natural intelligence no longer overshadowed by the weight of premature responsibility. She'd made friends, joined the art club, and was learning to simply be a child. The nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of becoming an artist or maybe a teacher who could help other scared children find their voices. Luke was enrolled in preschool and developing friendships with other children his age. His vocabulary had exploded once he felt secure, and he'd recently started asking David endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how computers worked. David had never imagined that "why, Daddy" could be his favorite phrase. "You know what I realized? David said as they settled back into their seats, the warmth of their embrace still lingering around them. "What?" Emma asked. "That night 6 months ago, you didn't just ask me to adopt you. You asked me to become the person I was meant to be. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself." Emma smiled, and David saw echoes of the woman she would someday become, strong, compassionate, unafraid to fight for what mattered. Mama used to say that love isn't about perfect people finding each other. It's about broken people healing together. David felt tears slip down his cheeks, not caring who might see the successful businessman crying in the city's most exclusive restaurant. "Your mama was very wise, and I think she'd be proud of the incredible young woman you're becoming, and the amazing little boy Luke is growing into." "Do you think they can see us?" Luke asked, with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a 4-year-old. David looked at his son, and felt the truth of his answer in every fibre of his being. "I think they can. And I think they're happy that their children found someone who loves them exactly as much as they did." As they shared their celebration dinner, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared, lonely man who had once eaten dinner alone every night had discovered that the greatest business deal of his life hadn't happened in a boardroom. It had happened right here, when a brave little girl offered to wash dishes in exchange for a family. Emma had kept her part of the bargain in ways she'd never intended. She hadn't washed his dishes, but she had washed away his loneliness, his fear of vulnerability, his carefully constructed walls. She and Luke had taught him that the most important success wasn't measured in profits or achievements, but in the love that grew between people who chose to care for each other. When they finally left the restaurant that night, David carrying a sleepy Luke, while Emma walked beside them, chattering about her plans for their upcoming vacation, David realized that he'd found something more valuable than any fortune he'd ever built. He'd found his purpose, his joy, his reason for being. He'd found his family. And as they drove home through the Seattle night, past the city lights that had witnessed the beginning of their story, David knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them, not as strangers who'd found each other by chance, but as a family bound by choice, strengthened by love, and unbreakable in their commitment to each other. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest words. In their case, it had started with, "I wash dishes, and you adopt us." But it had become so much more than anyone could have imagined, a love story that would last forever.